Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to today's podcast. During the recent presidential campaign, we all heard a lot about Solyndra, the solar startup that received a sizable government loan only to go belly up. Now, if you believe the word of solar's detractors, that the collapse of Solyndra proves solar is just a hippie pipe dream, today's guest, Danny Kennedy, co-founder and president of Sizable and author of Rooftop Revolution, says the truth is quite the opposite. According to Danny, Solyndra's downfall actually happened because it wasn't able to compete in a red-hot industry, not because solar isn't ready for prime time. The industry employs 100,000 people in the United States, twice as many as in 2009, twice the number of coal miners. And in 2011, Warren Buffett invested $2 billion in a solar farm, and General Electric bought a startup solar manufacturer announcing, this is a quote from GE, by 2020, this is going to be at least a $1 billion product line. Production of solar-generated electricity rose by 45% in the first 3 quarters of 2010, while electricity from natural gas rose only 1.6%, and coal declined by 4.2%. So while opponents claim solar is expensive, inefficient, unreliable, in his first book, Kennedy shows how solar can save money, create jobs, and protect the environment if only politics and perception will get out of the way. He argues for a rooftop revolution to break the entrenched power of the coal, oil, nuclear, and natural gas industries and their progress-defying allies. Here on Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, and provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, media, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Danny Kennedy is co-founder and president of Sizable, a global leader in residential solar power. He was previously the campaigns manager for Greenpeace Australia Pacific, and in 2001 he ran Greenpeace's California Clean Energy Campaign, the success of which helped lead to the current California Solar Initiative. Danny was the founder and first executive director of Project Underground, serves on several nonprofit boards, and his first book is Rooftop Revolution, How Solar Power Can Save Our Economy and Our Planet from Dirty Energy. Welcome, Danny Kennedy, to Freeforum.
Thanks so much for having me. It's fun to be here.
I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work that we end up talking about. So could you briefly talk about your personal path to the work that you're doing today? And feel free to cite mentors, turning points, moments of decision. And, we're sitting together here for an hour, so you don't have to just jump to last year.
Okay, thanks. So I should start with Los Angeles, because I'm from here. I was born here to Australian parents. I know I don't sound like it.
I was going to say, what part of LA is that accent?
But moved away when I was a kid, and yet have always had it in my mind's eye, as the place of my birth, and growing up here until I was about 9. Loved it, and the sunny and 73 thing sort of stuck with me. And then I went to Sydney, Australia, where similarly beautiful blue skies, and always have had this sense of there's so much power radiating free from the sky. Surely we can do better than this thing where we look underground and dig stuff up and burn it to boil water to create electricity. And over time, I think, that's borne out in my life through working firstly on the front line of communities resisting oil and coal and other mining exploitation, mostly indigenous people, of course, around the world, usurped by the powers that be that want to extract those fossil energies. Did a lot of human rights and environmental work in the 80s and 90s around that stuff, some atmospheric science policy work with the Australian government, and then started working again with Greenpeace the second time round in 2001, here in California, as you mentioned. And we did a couple of campaigns, one around the Los Angeles Community College District, which was a lot of fun, got the students to demand of the trustees here with the LACCD to go solar and do energy efficiency and LEED standard buildings with the retrofit bond that the people of LA had just approved. We lobbied Sacramento to do right by the power authority that they had around the Enron crisis. But we also ran a proposition with a bunch of other nonprofits in San Francisco, which is my point to answer your question. We were putting out one of those bond initiatives. City of San Francisco put out $100 million worth of bonds to fund clean energy, particularly solar, for their municipal utility district. And this proposition got 73% of the vote back in 2001. So I tell that story because it was one of those aha moments in someone's life. I've been a political animal since I was 12 years old doing electoral work in Australia, and I'd never seen something get 3/4 of the population to go for it. And here in the States, in this, at the time, fairly polarized country, maybe not as much as today, you're getting 73% of people to vote, yes, solar, go. And I don't think that cue was missed by many people either. I think a lot of politicians up in Sacramento and down here in LA recognized that for what the signal was, which is this stuff is, popular. And sure enough, Schwarzenegger, when he came to depose the then governor, Gray Davis, ran almost, not entirely, but largely on a solar initiative, the California Solar Initiative, which was his big vision for bringing 21st century business to the state. And he did well with it, and all power to him for it. $3 billion of ratepayers' money, not taxpayers' money, used to incentivize this business that now employs 40,000 Californians, that now saves tens of thousands of Californian families money on their budget, and that has spawned this fantastic industry, which California is really in the hot seat for. So that was a big turning point, I would say. And along the way, have had just a lot of inspiring people to work with, to tell me what's bad about the fossil world we're coming out of and what's great about the light that we're moving into, which is this solar economy that I think is right on the cusp and is going to surprise us as to how quickly it dawns.
We're going to go into a lot of the factual stuff. I want to stay with your personal for a little bit longer. Everyone knows about Greenpeace. What was Project Underground?
We did work directly with communities in the 90s fighting oil and mining exploitation at the site, basically. And often it was more like human rights work. It was like going in to document civil and political rights abuses, supporting people to flee if they were refugees, disclosing, assassinations and torture and all sorts of abuses of these communities. We're talking about in places like Nigeria, Colombia, Indonesia.
Yeah, I actually had met Terry Freitas.
Okay. Yeah.
Three times before he headed down to Colombia, just so people get a hint of how some of this work is really life or death. Tell just a little bit about Terry's experience.
Sure, and it's very sad for me still. Terry was a young guy that I guess, in a way I gave the first job to for Project Underground, working on something called the Uwa Defense Project, a tribe in Colombia called the Uwa, who famously said they would not accept Occidental Petroleum from here in LA drilling on their sacred lands. They thought oil, they knew it existed in their lands. They thought it was the blood of their mother, and they wouldn't take it. And if push came to shove, no pun intended, they'd actually commit mass suicide. It became a bit of a cause célèbre in the late 90s and around Gore's dad, who was sitting on the board of Oxy at the time. We did a lot of work down here in LA organizing with community folk here and raising a stink about it and with shareholders and so on. But Terence was one of the key contacts between community leaders in Colombia and the Solidarity movement up here, and he operated in that mode for a number of years, finally doing more cultural work and trying to support them, and was down there in Colombia for a trip with two Native American women, sort of indigenous leaders, doing language protection and all this important work to kind of keep the books of indigenous wisdom that are so quickly being burnt on this earth. And unfortunately, the three of them were taken hostage by FARC. This is in 99, February of 99. And a week or so later, they were found murdered on the Venezuelan border. There were certainly some signs that it was funded as a hit by oil interests.
Yeah, because it does seem unusual. FARC, we usually revolutionary, drugs. That's sort of nexus, and yet this is obviously.
You don't want to be caught by a brigade of FARC down there, I don't think. But we were figuring it was a ransom play, and instead it turned into an extrajudicial killing. And tragic, for Terry's family who lived down here in LA. But, that is a sad, tragic story. It's what those communities on the front line of fossil fuel extraction live with day in, day out. Whether it's Native America here still today, frontline communities fighting off sort of the extreme energy extraction that is going on with fracking and, the mega coal expansions around the world. That's been the history of over 100 years of dependence on this dumb way of digging up 200 million year old sunlight, which is what those fossil fuels are. And what we've done, lo and behold, is invented a machine that allows us to extract energy direct from the source without having to go through those middlemen. And of course, the middlemen don't like being cut out, and they'll resist this as long as they can. But ultimately, the sense of taking solar energy direct rather than taking it from underground where it was laid for 200 million years, where it was fossilized as plant matter, is going to happen. That transition's inevitable. It's now a question of hastening that inevitable transition.
Right. I'm Terrence McNally, and I'm speaking with Danny Kennedy, founder and president of Sungevity, author of Rooftop Revolution, How Solar Power Can Save Our Economy and Our Planet from Dirty Energy. This seems like a big change for you, from activist advocate to businessman. Or is it? Because when I look at your book title, it's got the word revolution in it. So is there something in here with how you're approaching it, what you think is necessary and so on, that sort of begins to blend the two?
Look, I think solar power is inherently revolutionary. It distributes power, both figurative and literal, to the user. And that's very different to the sort of central station model of power systems that we've inherited from these incumbent technology sets, whether they be electricity generated out in the desert, shipped into market from thousands of miles away, all one directional from a big monopoly, or whether it be from the oil boys selling us the fuel for our mobility requirements. Once we unleash electricity into the hands of the people, and they start to work with it, kind of like they have information in the last decades with the revolutionary technology changes and the information economy, then they will be usurped, no question. They won't be able to centralize and control like they have. They'll have to play in a bidirectional, multidirectional electricity co-consumer production kind of world.
In media, we reached the kind of the apex of broadcast media maybe 20 years ago.
Right.
And you had, maybe 30 years ago, but 3 networks, power, only going one way, and that's still the way energy is for the most part, but...
Correct. And the future is a bit more like Twitter and your blogging and your website and self-publishing and co-creation of content in media to completely undo these empires of record companies and movie moguls and whatever with YouTube and Twitter and file sharing and all the rest of it. Likewise, that will happen to the electricity sector, and electricity will take over, in my view, the mobility sector. We will use electrification rather than burning stuff in the internal combustion engine. So that's the good news, and it is a revolution. And to your question, is this different for me? No, it's on song. It's the same purpose. It's using a different vehicle for the kind of campaigning I've always done. And in fact, I've really enjoyed working in the business world. It's been a pleasure to date. Don't know whether it'll continue to be so, but, small business has a lot of the hallmarks of nonprofits. It's like aligning a bunch of people to a common purpose, getting them set on goals, motivating them to achieve those, and, fundraising and communicating and doing all the things that you do in a nonprofit as well with activism. So some of the skills seemed, useful. And the ability to harness economics as the argument and as the motive are really exciting. They're really powerful things.
Yeah. You begin the book, Rooftop Revolution, with a primer on electricity, its history, how it's generated, how it's distributed. And obviously, even in just the first few minutes we've been talking, we've referred here and there to some of those things. Could you do a brief primer right now? Because my guess is why you put that in the front of your book is that you know that out there there's a mixture of lack of knowledge, a little bit of knowledge, etc.
Sure. A couple of things. One is just price per kilowatt hour. Probably most of the listeners right now on the show don't know what they pay per kilowatt hour for their electricity. And that's the really important number. And the second thing is pretty much all electricity comes from the sun. It's all solar energy converted to power for our use through different means. Even wind and hydroelectricity are a form of solar energy in the hydrologic cycle, evaporating water off the oceans, letting it run down rivers and be stuck in dams and then go through a reservoir and a turbine, or wind as the transfer of heat across the planet, etc., all to do with the sun. So we have these very complicated, convoluted processes, the worst of which are things like digging up coal or oil or natural gas to create electricity, because that's taking sunlight that fell on Earth 200 million years ago in the era of dinosaurs, became plants, most commonly a fern. Those ferns fell over and got buried by mud. That mud then encapsulated them and allowed them to turn into this various forms of black carbonic gunk. And we now dig that up all around the world, whether it's out in Navajo land for Los Angeles' electricity, or whether it's in Colombia to ship to China, or Australia to ship to Europe, and burn it. To boil water is one of the funniest steps. You know, this old steam turbine tool that we use requires a lot of water.
And that is the middleman in
all of it.
I mean, in nuclear and right? It's
steam kettles. Yeah. There's, you know, people say, oh, solar power is not efficient. It's like, I beg your pardon. Like, you know, it takes 15% of the photons falling from the sky and turns them into electrons. Photosynthesis doesn't even have that efficiency in creating carbohydrates in a plant when the photon first hits it. So it's a very efficient machine. Take just the steam turbine bit, and you've got Brownian motion at work. You know, you're boiling water to create excited atoms of steam to drive an electric turbine. It's crazy stuff. And yet we've had it for over 100 years as the mainstay of electricity generation because we allowed these companies to have monopoly over their markets, and they've really not been exposed to competition. And so in comes a machine called the solar panel in the 50s, invented here in America, which is pure competition. It's just a different and better way of doing electricity generation. No moving parts is the killer asset. So it's just a semiconductor of silicon doped with some chemicals, photons fall on it, electrons pop out. Albert Einstein described the photoelectric effect. That's what he got his Nobel for 50 years earlier. They didn't really work it out to the 50s in the States. And it's taken another 50 years to make it at scale, basically.
And what does at scale mean?
Scale means we're manufacturing it in volumes where it becomes cheaper and cheaper each generation. And that is the key, to come back to the first number, the kilowatt hour number, that drives the inevitability of solar, because it's called a technology curve. Every doubling of the volume of manufacturing of solar cells, the silicon cells that make up a solar panel, has resulted in a 16 to 18% reduction in the price of the cell and the electricity coming out of it. It's kind of like Moore's law with silicon chips. Every doubling increased the power and reduced the cost, such that silicon chips became so cheap we started sticking them in phones. Who would have thought 20 years ago we'd put silicon chips in phones to do microprocessing? But here we are with a far better service now, the iPhone that all of the listeners are probably hanging on to, that does everything for us because its power as a computer is greater than what NASA had for computing back in the 60s when they put man on the moon.
Right. Yeah.
So that technological curve is the same driver, which is reducing price for solar power in the planet. So back to the fossil side of the equation. The curve there is very different. It's what economists call scarcity.
Right.
So no matter what hype they say about natural gas is now going to last another century, you know, blah, blah, for fracking
Right. In other
reasons.
words, the answer being, don't worry about peak oil, natural gas is going to replace it.
But they're finite resources. They have to admit that at the end of the day. They can't dig up the whole Earth's crust. Or if they do, they run out of it anyway. And finite things exposed to growing demand become more expensive. And if you look at the price of electricity from fossils, they become more expensive over time. If you look at the price from solar, it becomes less expensive. Those two curves are inexorable. They will continue through time. My company, Sungevity, can give you a solar panel for no money down, no deposit required, and you're paying about 17 cents for the electricity coming out of it per kilowatt hour. That's less than what a lot of Los Angelinos pay for their electricity today. So you save money by going solar right now with no investment. that curve will only continue. More and more niches will open up, more and more applications for the solar panel, this wonderful machine that's so efficient at converting solar energy to power for our use, will become cost effective. And that's all she wrote. That's the story of history. As I said earlier, the game now is to hasten that.
Right. In other words,
that turn of creative destruction needs to happen sooner.
I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Danny Kennedy. He's co-founder and president of Sengevity, author of Rooftop Revolution, How Solar Power Can Save Our Economy and Our Planet from Dirty Energy. It sounds like, as you describe it, that the obstacle or anything that gives the appearance of it not being inevitable is really just how slow it's been going. And the speed has increased, but it's when there were obstacles to adoption, that was not just a strategy, it was an effective strategy to keep these two curves from meeting. But once we begin to move into rapid adoption, the curves become closer faster.
And that's happening now.
Yeah.
We're in that moment. It may not feel like it, but we've sort of crossed the
But it would
cusp.
feel like it if we were in Germany.
Or China. What it feels like, if listeners can remember, is, the moment somewhere between when they saw the rich white guy in the suit with a huge brick stuck to his head that was called a mobile phone, and the Android smartphone that a kid in Mexico can now buy for less than $100 and be connected to all of literature, all of the internet, all of the global economy through online commerce, this radio station, everything through that smartphone. That was 20 years, maybe, between that first image of a mobile phone in your head and the current version of a smartphone in your hand. When did that tip? I can't exactly remember, but that's the moment we're at right now with solar. It is being taken up incredibly. As you mentioned, Germany, this country which all the naysayers want to believe, it's going to fail and this solar experiment, forget about it. A year ago now, January 2012, they were saying, with having turned off the nukes in 2010 and 11 after Fukushima, spent too much on solar, the solar industry is going to crash, it's going to dive off the cliff, and they're going to have to turn the nukes back on, they're going to have electricity shortages. None of it. The solar industries continue to pace. They put another 7 gigawatts. That's like 15 big power plants put into Germany in the last year alone.
In the last year.
There's 32 gigawatts now installed. They haven't had to turn off their nukes. And on the contrary, they're producing so much electricity from wind and solar sources that at times they dump free electricity on neighboring countries.
Wow. Well, I had OSHA Gray Davidson on, Clean Break,
Yep.
just a few weeks ago. And just a statistic for people who missed that show, America gets 6% of its energy from renewables right now. In 2000, that's what Germany got. Today, Germany gets 26%. So this can happen. And Germany is the number one exporting country in the world. This is not, with only 83 million people, they are efficient. They're using a lot of juice, but they're getting now over a quarter of it from renewables. And as you say, increasing faster and faster.
And to give you a sense of where it can go, just a vision perhaps, but a day in May or a few days in May last year, over 50% of the electrons flowing to end use, radios, lights, etc., were solar electrons, just direct from solar panels somewhere in Germany.
So that 26% I'm saying is for the whole year, but on certain days it's already up to 50%.
Correct. You can do it for a day, you can do it for a week, you can do it for a month,
And think about the German mentality, folks.
Yeah.
It is not it is a practical engineering. They're doing this not to be hippies. They're doing this not because the Greens are powerful in Germany, although that may have helped them get started. But it's doing it because it works.
This is Angela Merkel. She's center right at best.
Exactly.
So absolutely. And that's the good thing about the story of solar. It can cross the aisle, if you will, and can reach across. Like I said at the start, that aha moment for me, 73% of the San Francisco electorate, even though it's San Francisco values up there, 3/4, come on.
Yeah,
this
especially
is
because
red
we
and blue.
assume any proposition, and certainly anyone that raises money in any way, is that the default is no.
Yeah.
In other words, when a political
Correct.
consultant looks at any proposition campaign, how much do we have to do to get over that hump? Because the default is, I don't know enough about it, why bother?
And this is, why we appeal to so many people in the States is energy independence truly. we can give you the power on your own home to produce your own electricity. You can cut that cord with that utility that you don't really know or understand, and them with their fuel provider, wherever that is, whether it's foreigners from Canada or Venezuela or whatever, or whether it's some domestic source that we can't afford. This notion of energy independence, it makes me laugh when I hear fossil fuel advocates using energy independence to describe their business model. That is dependence, exactly.
Personified, as
and
it were.
and the Middle East is an imbroglio that is because of our dependence on that particular form of fossil fuels for the transport sector. As I say, we build out this solar economy with an American invention, with American smarts, American companies like Sungevity, American solutions like the solar lease to finance it as you go. And we can free ourselves from their yoke. We don't have to send our men and lose our treasure for these silly wars for oil. We can do everything we need with electricity and then some. That's the beauty of it. You can get to an energy abundance.
And the thing which you talked about, but which, again, people might not be tracking right now, is that, again, I'm just going to use the Germany example because I see that's where we're going, is remember, it isn't just that they're using solar. It's that they have gone from the centralized big power companies to this distributed and distributive model. Correct. Where you produce it yourself, you use what you use, you send some back to the energy companies, and not only that, the ownership in Germany. The ownership of the renewable energy, 65% of it is cooperatives, communities, unions, that sort of thing.
Farmers and the people themselves owning the system on their homes. Absolutely. And that's a very different situation to the thrall that we're in with fossil fuels, where we're dependent on, you name them, half a dozen companies for the fuel supply and for the distribution and generation of the power. So here we have the opportunity to put that in the hands of the people. Much better model. And, Germany, you don't have to go that far. Los Angeles is becoming a model of this too, with the feed-in tariff just passed here at the LA Council. All power to you lot for demonstrating by doing now. I think just last Friday there was a pilot announced for 20 megawatts at that first big tranche of the feed-in tariff. That's very exciting. Multi-tenant dwellings will get solar systems in Los Angeles. People will get to own these. And the economics now sit to create lots of jobs.
And this is that very recent thing where DWP said for the first time now we can begin that energy as an interactive phenomenon, just as information has become.
Correct. And moreover, they're going to pay a premium tariff for the electricity coming off people's roofs under this program.
Yeah. I want to cover it twice during the hour. But you've mentioned it a few times, and I'm not doing this to plug Sungevity because you're not the only ones who do it. But I think it is a surprise to me when I read the book, actually, and I've been looking at this stuff a lot, and I'll bet a surprise to a lot of listeners, how you can actually get power for no upfront cost. Explain that, and it's that PAA, that
PPA, Power Purchase Agreement. Well, actually, we do it slightly different, but it's called a solar lease, if you think about a lease.
And so you can explain yours, but the others are varieties of the same.
Correct. And let's take it back a bit to so you got this magic machine that does this incredible important thing called electricity service, but we haven't been able to adopt it en masse. Why? One of the answers is because of the awareness that it's ready for prime time, like you said, and the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that's been seeded in our minds about it by the fossil fuel industry. Another reason than awareness is the affordability and the accessibility of it. And key to the affordability was that until recently, solar has been sold as a wham bam, thank you ma'am sort of product, not a service. So you bought the hardware to put on your house, and that immediately infers you've got disposable income and you can buy a piece of hardware, some kit, which a decade ago cost tens of thousands of dollars, whereas today it's significantly less. But still, just having to fork out a big chunk of change to start the process of going solar is a barrier to entry. So what we've done, along with some other companies, as you mentioned, is taken away that cost and said, for no money down, you can go solar and pay us monthly for it instead. And the monthly...
So you own the panels?
We own the panels with a bank in our case. So we've financed the power plant on your roof, and you pay it off over time by paying for the electricity. Very much like, if you think about it, the power plant out in the desert on Navajo land that's paid for by some debt provider who pays the utility to create the generating station, and then they pay it off by selling, through the revenue they earn by selling you electricity.
When you made the analogy before about the big car phones,
right?
Yeah. And when those big car phones first came out, you paid $1,000,
Correct.
$1,200, $1,500 for that car phone.
Exactly.
Now, in almost all cases, you pay nothing for the phone because you sign up with your provider, and they are glad to give you the phone because you're paying for the service.
Exactly the same. They cover the cost of the hardware in the course of the contract, which is what we're doing in the contract for electricity service, in this case, clean electricity from your roof. So this has allowed now the mass adoption of solar, and it's just been available a few years, 4 years now, but it's gone from 0% of the market to 70% of the market. So the people have spoken.
And is that the entire market or just the residential market?
The residential market
Okay.
in the US. The democratization that it allows of solar, in LA, it used to broadly be a matter for West LA, Malibu and that side of the 405. Now, we've got solar panels going in all across the Inland Empire, all through Los Angeles territory, because it makes sense for middle-class families that want to reduce their electricity cost. Because the trick that I didn't mention is, for most of them, 80+% of our customers, we actually save them money the first month they're going solar. So they've made no investment, no deposit required. They go solar, and their bill, plus the bill they'll still get from the utility for nighttime usage, will be less than those two combined, their old electricity bill in most cases. So they're saving money, and over the course of the lease, they'll save tens of thousands of dollars, perhaps, and be able to put that away into other family business.
I'm Terrence McNally, and I'm speaking with Danny Kennedy. He's a co-founder and president of Sungevity, one of the big players in residential solar, and he's the author of Rooftop Revolution, How Solar Power Can Save Our Economy and Our Planet from Dirty Energy. And I will mention for any of you that are tuning in just now, he comes into this after years with Greenpeace and Underground and so on, of being an advocate for such solutions and against always, but now is on the business side of this. When I hear what you just said, I think the catch, if there is, that it pops up in my head is, well, what about if it takes you 20 years of my monthly payments to pay off the upfront that you put out so that I could get the service? What happens if I sell the house?
So you transfer it to the next owner.
How's that going?
Very easy. It's pretty simple forward paperwork.
Well, but I meant, is there anyone that goes, like Ronald Reagan, when Carter passed them on to him, he said, I don't want them.
No, it's really not a big deal for homeowners, partly because it attracts buyers. It's a real signal, and mortgage appraisers are now appraising solar homes for greater value, and they're showing that they move faster off the market. So,
and this is true in all parts of the city? In other words, that isn't just on the west side, that's wherever they are?
Correct. Because it's a signal that, A, this homeowner took care of their home and was thinking about their budget and their own costs. And B, they're leaving me something that's going to be lower cost than if I was just connected to the grid only. Right. So, it's a great boon, and we actually think it facilitates the sale of homes, and people appreciate that. Okay,
because that was my question. As we know, if you leave your contract with your cell phone provider, there's a big hit.
Yeah.
So the thing is here, you don't want to leave your provider, but what you're saying is people don't want to.
Right. We aren't getting the case where people ask us to come and take them off. There would be a hit for that. We'd have to charge you for that, for breaking the lease. But instead, it's a relatively simple matter to hand it on to the next owner.
Okay. Just one other thing I want to, since I touched on in the introduction, tell us a little bit, actually flesh out a little bit the Solyndra controversy. Because for some people, that was the biggest solar news of the last year.
Yeah, but, I hope those people are able to look back on the last year and realize they were part of a beat-up in the classic media sense. It was just one of those words that was spoken enough, hoping that you throw enough mud, some will stick. I mean, it's such a silly syllogism for the Republicans to have attempted. Oh, Obama's green agenda loans some money to company fails, therefore Obama fails. It doesn't actually add up. As you said, it was actually evidence of the fact that the solar market is becoming red hot because it's very competitive now. Costs are crashing in the normal form factor silicon-based solar panels. And so this different form factor Solyndra was attempting, a parabolic trough with a tube filled with gaseous photovoltaic material, just was never going to compete in that environment. It couldn't afford, through its cost structure, to compete.
So it had, as I recall, it had a radical innovation idea, which may be what attracted some of the things. But what you're saying is that the less radical has been falling in cost so much.
Yeah. and they were trying to introduce VHS when beta is going to be stuck with, and beta, as we all know from the legend, is better. I mean, silly analogy, but perhaps to try another one, what really was happening was that you had opponents to Solyndra trying to beat up a story to say the failure of Netscape means that the internet is never going to happen.
There's a good analogy.
And how stupid would you look if you had said that? That is how stupid people that said Solyndra's failure is evidence of the failure of solar.
Right. And as you point out, it's exactly the opposite. The failure of either a poorly managed company or an uncapitalized company, they fail because the industry is hot and the survival of the fittest.
What frustrates me, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, Rooftop Revolution, was because this is what America's great at. Trying to innovate. This is an American invention, as I mentioned, from the 50s in New Jersey. It revolutionizes how we do electricity on this earth. It completely busts the trusts in the great American tradition of breaking monopoly power, and it frees something important for all of us, electricity service. And yet we have politicians standing up railing against its success when it will serve people of all walks of life, both sides of the aisle, red, white and blue states of the Union will be served by this technology. And they want it to fail because they're in bed and beholden to oil, gas, and coal interests. That's the bottom line of this story. And it's so transparent in the way they treated Solyndra. So, just underscoring, don't believe the hype. Think through this. Here's the case. A company, for whatever reason, didn't work. But we shouldn't, at least, completely condemn failure. We should support people to have a go and try this entrepreneurial capitalism that California in particular has been so good at over a century. We need to create more of in this day and age because of the threat of climate change.
Well, that's right. So you're saying two things there. One, take a different lesson from Solyndra, but the second lesson is, and the fact that someone got a $500 million loan and failed doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to fund startups.
I mean, that portfolio, which, by the way, was started by Bush for the DOE grant program, has had a very low rate of failure. I mean, compared to the VCs up on Sand Hill Road, it's like a really effective fund. And, you can kvetch about how this particular one was done, and we don't take any government money, so I don't have a view. But my point is we need entrepreneurs now more than ever. Yeah. And to make such a sort of cultural whipping boy out of Solyndra is to sort of send a signal to the kids of America that you shouldn't try to make this thing solar succeed in the 21st century, even though we need it, even though it cleans the air, even though it saves our kids from asthma, even though it will create huge value and jobs, all the good that it brings, but you don't want to be a pariah like that company that we just went hard to. That was the inherent effort of those Republican and other,
and as we know, I mean, an awful lot of that money, if we just look at the Koch brothers, comes from fossil fuels.
Correct.
Could you compare, in whatever way is on the tip of your tongue, installation rates and prices of, say, solar, wind, coal, gas, nuclear in the U.S. and globally, just so people get a picture kind of what's happening?
So last year in 2012, there was much hype again, promoted by fossil fuel interests that want to tell their story and their side of this about gas, right? The natural gas phenomena, and coal is crashing. And that's the one good side effect of gas coming up in the mix, is that coal really is, aside from just the price of gas coming down to compete with it, coal is also being shut down by legislation, by the EPA actually asserting some rules around the co-pollutants and so on.
One thing that anybody who is looking for good news, which obviously we're giving them a lot of it, that campaign by Sierra Club and others.
Well, I was going to say, say it was 50% of the mix 2010, it was just over a third, so 33%. A lot of that, like 18 gigawatts or something in that order of coal plants all over the country, were being shut down by grassroots movements, Sierra Club and others, partnering in legislation, litigation, and just good old-fashioned community organizing to shut down
134 coal plants either closed or not allowed to go forward in the last couple of years.
Phenomenal.
It's amazing.
But, that was...
And not much publicity.
10 years of work before it to get there. Don't forget how the struggle takes time. And so that's been succeeding. So coal has crashed. Meanwhile, new additions that are coming onto the grid, there's been much talk of gas taking its place. But actually, last year, 2012, 50% was gas and 50% was wind and solar. So half the new market is wind and solar. Solar is still the smallest piece of that, but it's growing exponentially. And exponential curves can sort of surprise you. Again, think back to the cell phone. When was it 1% of the market? When was it 2? Then it was 4, then it was 8. I gave a lecture recently at UC Berkeley to 500 students, and I asked them, how many of you have a landline? And 3 did. And then I asked them, how many of you don't have a cell phone? And 3 didn't have a cell phone. So, the world has flipped from landline telephony to cellular telephony. The world is flipping from landline central station electricity to cellular modular electricity, and that's the process we're in the midst of.
The numbers that you gave just then about coal falling and 50-50, that's U.S., right?
That's U.S. new additions. Even more exciting things in other countries. So I come from Australia, where when I left to start Songevity in 2007 here in the States, there was not a lot of solar at all. Now it's at 2% of power capacity. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's 750,000 roofs. So that's close to 10% of the households in Australia, because remember, Australia has the population of the Greater Los Angeles region, 20 million people sort of thing. So you've got 10% of people with solar on their roof, 2% of power capacity. It's doubling every 9 months in their case. That's the rate of doubling. So the exponentiality is 2 goes to 4, goes to 8, goes to 16, goes to 32, 64. Boom, you're done by 2020 if it continues at that clip. I'm not saying it will, but it has that potential to jump up on us like other mass adoption of technologies does.
A phenomenon that we've seen, and cell phone again is the perfect example, for less developed countries to leapfrog. That is to skip landlines completely in Africa and go straight to cell phones. So is that happening?
Absolutely. And to the point of the book, this is the greatest economic opportunity of our time. Entrepreneurialism will reign again, and hopefully this country will lead that. But a lot of it will be at the bottom of the so-called pyramid. There's about 1.5 billion people without electricity. So here, all your listeners, take electricity for granted, right? Here they've never enjoyed it. And yet they're getting it in the course of not a lifetime, but like a decade or less, because of these technologies. In Africa, it's spreading like wildfire. I mean, the numbers are hard to keep up with because it's happening so fast. In India, there's still 500 million people without electricity, but the Indian state is intent on using distributed resources, and PV in particular, which they have this incredible roadmap to distribute, photovoltaics, that is, to the Indian population. And in China, likewise. There's a lot of electricity in China. It's patchy service, but most people there get it. But still, as we all know, they're building out enormous new capacity every year in China. And there's something like 1,000 gigawatts still to be built, which is, multiples of the US entire grid. But the good news is, in China, because of this mass production phenomenon, this technology curve, it's becoming so cost effective that it's being selected for utility scale projects ahead of gas and coal in some places. And the economics suggests that that's the way it should be, because it's cheaper per watt installed than the price of a coal plant or even a gas plant going forward in that market. So, yeah, you could see the true leapfrogging. We've talked about that for a long time. But again, just like cell phones have spread across Africa, a leapfrogging of solar electricity into service in Africa.
And one of the things that does is it takes, and not to calm anyone too much, but it takes projections about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change and so on, and improves them dramatically. In other words, the projections that were, if we kept doing what we're doing, this is where we'll get to. Well, it turns out we're not.
Right. So, I spent most of my career at Greenpeace and cut my teeth on atmosphere politics in the 90s with them. And the Gordian knot has always been, we want these people, and it is their right to benefit from electricity, just as we all have in our lives. This is back then a couple of billion, and now half a billion or so have gotten it. They all need to get it to engage in education and entertainment as we do, and the economy as we do now through the internet and all the rest. And that's their right, and it needs to be met. But if it's done with coal, we are literally cooked. Like, there's no one in their right mind that doesn't think the logic of that isn't way too much warming. If it's done with clean, we might have a shot. If it's done with clean by 2030, we're okay. We're probably okay.
So what you're saying is that the faster the clean, we're saying, oh, that's good, it's nice, but you're saying that is one of the key components to whether we avert the worst of this.
To do with the lag in the climate system, but also in the energy system. You know, when you put in a fossil plant, once you've invested in that stock, you need to run it for its 50-year life to get the money out, just like we need to run the thing on the roof for 20. So we need the changes in the mix to happen in the front end of this decade and the next decade in order for the sort of momentum to be that it's clean predominantly going forward, particularly for those build-outs in places where there is no electricity grid. If they go to a central station grid, spend all that money building all that infrastructure, then, you know, there's a lock-in to running the fuel through it.
And by the way, as any of you who have followed global development, that thing of the big dam, the big, right, has been the sort of the hallmark of aid, which allowed small oligarchies in these companies, the ones who managed to get in bed with the IMF or the World Bank and get that big dam or that big power plant. And this breaks that all down. That's what struck me as interesting, that India, which has always raved about its big dams and its nuclear weapons and so on, is going for distributed energy. What's that about?
Mostly it's about cost. It's ultimately about the economics. You know, it just doesn't make sense to make the mistake we made to build your system on coal.
If your political system gets jiggered in the process, so be it.
But you're right. You know, that is too often the case here as well. But, you know, we have it in our hands now, the technology that not only alters the power supply, but the very power relations. It's why it's such a big ask and it's such a big push for we as citizens' movements to get it over the line. But it's going to happen. It's you know, why I harp on about the first family going solar, to put the panels back on the White House. Because...
And they haven't yet.
No. Go to rooftopRevolutionbook.com and you can sort of sign a petition.
There's a place to sign a petition. President, where are the panels?
Might have seen our Bo Obama's inauguration party last week. We've shot a little fun film about it. But, you know, the signal from the most famous house in the world saying... Now it is ready for prime time. It saves taxpayers money. It creates jobs in this depressed city called DC. It is an American technology that we can deploy on our own homes to create energy independence. That's an important signal. You know, it's beyond a symbol. It's a statement which has some good of itself, and it will, you know, be a shot that will be heard around the world. We need that as much as we need him to say no to Keystone XL. You know, we need the decision by India's and the Brahmins and others in control of various societies to embrace this and work out what their relationship with it is going to be. Just as, you know, we've watered down the power of the media empires.
That's what I was thinking. And if someone had told you, you know, 20 years ago, there's this thing called the internet, but we're going to slow it down, you won't get it for 20 years.
All hell would have broken loose. Because
and
all
that's
these
essentially
benefits,
where we kind of are right now.
And yet you can't stop it.
Yeah.
It's like fighting the tide.
Yeah.
And that to me is the key. You know, the listeners out there hopefully will take from this, A, they should go to Sungevity or another company and get a quote and go solar. But B, think about how they can get involved in the solar ascent, is what I call it. Like, it's this inevitable thing. And it's not all bad news. You know, we talk too much about the energy descent and the carbon problem, which are very real. But we have an opportunity in our lifetimes to create jobs, to create wealth, to create a new reality where energy is actually abundant in the form of electricity, but from clean sources that are very low cost.
As I've often said, in terms of jobs, you cannot outsource a retrofit. Mm-hmm. You know, that is to put better windows and better insulation, and you can't retrofit putting a panel on a roof.
Well, can I just do those?
You can't outsource that.
Can I just do those numbers for you? You mentioned them at the start, but actually they've improved even since I wrote the book because it's a year or more old data. So America's solar industry now employs 120,000 people. That's a census of actual jobs counted in solar companies around the country last October. 120,000 strong. The coal industry wholly, I've been criticized for saying the coal industry is miners. People have pointed out it's also railroad workers. Okay, so the railroad, 50% of freight on rail in this country is coal. So there's a few tens of thousands employed there, and then power plant operators burning coal to boil water, as we mentioned, in that old-fashioned steam turbine. So you got maybe 160,000 people total in the coal enterprise in this country, crashing as we speak. As Appalachia's coal fields shut, tens of thousands will leave the coal industry employment. So 160,000 total, about a third of electricity supply. We're 120,000 and less than 1% of electricity supply. We get to 10% in almost every model Like, conservative economists and political figures will say solar will be 10% by 2020, 2030. Does that mean we're 1 million plus workers? Probably not, because we'll achieve some efficiencies, but we're hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of industries offering that creation of employment in this country.
When you are doing anything you do decentralized,
correct,
means more jobs,
less offshoreable,
and
meaningful, locally employed,
Yeah.
with a purpose, better conditions, all the rest of it.
In other words, there's certain things you can do to do a skyscraper in some there's some things of scale. But when you do rooftop by rooftop by rooftop, that's individuals working. I'm talking to Danny Kennedy. We're talking about his book Rooftop Revolution. The myths: inefficiency, unreliability, and uneconomic.
The myths around solar are perpetrated by the people that don't want it to succeed, and they plant fear, uncertainty, and doubt in your heads a lot. The uneconomic one kills me. Again, no fuel cost. Ultimately, what's going to be cheaper? We don't put anything in the machine. They have to go to all ends of the earth to dig stuff up with all its costs of pollution, control, and the rest of it to burn it in their machine. So no fuel cost means we're ultimately cheaper, and we're fast becoming cheaper at the point of use. Where it matters is where you pay for it.
Because there's no transportation cost either.
Correct. So, from your roof to your light or stove or fridge, you might be paying as much as 30 plus cents a kilowatt hour in Los Angeles. We're selling it to you for half of that from your roof. So we're lower cost in many applications and fast across the spread of them. As for inefficiency, it's just a joke. We take it direct from the source. All electricity, like I mentioned, aside nukes, you could argue is stardust from another sun, but it's all from the sun. We're just getting it straight from the source and cutting out all the middlemen. And that's who we've offended by doing it. But we're the most efficient, and the efficiency improves every year. And then as to unreliability, therein lies some of the opportunity. Yes, we have to crack the nut on storage. Yes, we need to build better batteries. We need to work out other ways to spread solar around the grid so that everyone can maintain uptime. It's a challenge we can take on. We created the internet. We can answer a question in a second typing in a string of search terms. We can work out how to get 1,000 points of light electricity to the load as it happens. That's our challenge. That's the entrepreneurial opportunity that, again, my book concludes is the biggest piece of the puzzle. The rooftop revolution will happen when we have more solar entrepreneurs entering the economy and creating the businesses, kind of like the apps developers and the software guys and the hardware guys and the finance guys that have helped us spread cellular telephones around to the benefit of many.
One of the myths we hear about is peak load. Or one of the objections we hear is that solar can't hit peak load. And as you said, when you were describing the deal that someone can make in L.A. right now, is that they will still pay conventional energy producers for nighttime. Talk about those, either the nighttime gap or the peak load gap. How real is it, and how do you deal with it?
Base load and peaks are a creation or a fiction of the central station model. When you run a coal power plant, you've got to set it up and start burning stuff hours and hours before you get a head of steam to drive your turbine. And so basically the electrical guys want to create a certain amount of demand and always know what that is, and they call that base load, so that they're always selling a certain supply of electricity. And then at points there's more than that, and they've got to meet that with peak. But it's to suit their technology set, whereas what we need is a system that delivers electricity at the point of use, at the time of demand, from a local source. That is possible. It requires an information layer and a more sophisticated set of sensors and a bidirectional flow of electrons. But increasingly, as you get up to 50% of electrons in the mix in the grid in Germany, which, as you say, is no small country, you're demonstrating that it can be done. The Bavarians weren't going without cold beer that day. They had electricity as they needed it. It's just a challenge for the grid operators, and they can either fight the tide or they can get on board. And we, the people of America that created all the software that allowed the internet to blossom, can allow this energy internet to go forward as well.
Very good. Again, the book is Rooftop Revolution: How Solar Power Can Save Our Economy and Our Planet from Dirty Energy. Is there a website for the book? Is there a website other than the company?
Yeah. No, the book website is rooftoprevolutionbook.com. It's a Tumblr, a lot of fun stuff on there, a lot of content, including this petition to get solar back on the White House. Please go and sign it, watch the video, and take the Do Something pledge as well, because there you can do a bunch of other things to promote the solar ascent.
Okay, so rooftoprevolutionbook.com. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime during the week by linking to the podcast. You can sign up to have that delivered to you weekly. You can do both of those things either at iTunes or at my site, which is terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY, terrencemcnally.net, or A World That Just Might Work, all one word, aworldthatjustmightwork.com. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement that'll tell you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and 3 or 4 articles of background, you can either sign up for that at my website, or you can email me at TEMcNally, TEMCNALLY, TEMcNally@mac.com. Thanks to G, my engineer, Stan Mizrahi, and Mark Maxwell in production, and Matt Perez in traffic, and to you, my listeners. I look forward to being here again next week. And finally, thank you to Danny Kennedy. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.